Hi, and welcome to another edition of Probeline, coming to you from Steve's Guitars, where thanks to the support of GrassRoots donors, we've been able to set up a studio to do live music from here and other programming. I'd like to thank the folks at the Aspen Thrift Shop for their 15 years of support in bringing Probeline to you so that you can learn more about and get to know the candidates that are running for office locally. This is not the year that the Aspen Thrift Shop can support us because, as many of you know, they are closed due to COVID. So this is my appeal to ask that you donate to grassrootstv.org if you like GrassRoots TV, and particularly if you like Probeline, so that we can continue to bring you these conversations with candidates running for public office. Today, we're going to be speaking with Jeffrey Evans, who would like to be the County Commissioner for District 5. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
And you were county manager.
I'm interviewing you, Jeffrey.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes, I was. I was the county manager from 89 to 95, which is where you and I interacted a fair amount.
You haven't been county manager in 25 years?
Yes.
Wow. Well, anyway, let's go back to what you wanted to talk about. No, that's amazing to me. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's been that long. Yeah.
It has been that long.
Well,
and I'm doing fine.
I was going to say, are they paying you enough here? Or
Zero.
Oh, well, that'll go a long way.
That's right. They promised to double my salary if I do well, but it'll still be zero.
I could negotiate for you if you'd like. We can probably do even better than that.
Triple.
Percentage-wise, we can do even better than that.
Well, let's spend some time and try and get to know you a little bit. When you and I interacted, your issue was transportation and the straight shot into Aspen.
Very electric,
but that's
yes.
25 years ago.
I've been on that one since 1984 when I was on the highway committee in the City of Aspen. And we looked at 19 different options for how to handle the entrance to Aspen. And what we came up with was then went into the EIS process, which was begun in 1989 and was called the BOCC to Aspen EIS. And the state liked our work well enough that they took it and went ahead and evaluated it and had it as part of that EIS process. Would you like to pick it up from there? Where would you like to go with it?
What have you been doing since then?
Well, approximately 2020, I got to the point where it didn't seem that anybody was listening. So I said, why am I still talking if nobody's listening? And at about that same time, I met this very nice lady who puts up with me very nicely. She's, actually sort of appreciates my sense of humor, at least some of the time, and you know how important that is. And we both love to travel. So the last 20 years, my number one priority is to go places I haven't been yet, or that we haven't been yet.
Wow, so that explains why I haven't heard from you or seen you in the paper for some period of time.
Yeah, and I also moved up to the Avalanche Ranch area up the Crystal, and that was my tagline in my letters for a long time, up the Crystal. I'm now living in the southern section of the Salt. So in terms of District 5, I've lived in the most rural portions of it and what is literally the urban portion of District 5. So I've been in one or the other now for 25 years.
And during that time you were traveling a lot?
A lot.
Where did you get to go?
I've been doing really simple seasonal jobs for the purpose of being able to have the time to travel. So one of my jobs is with CTS Aspen Limousine. They've got the big 28-seaters that handle big corporate events and major weddings, and their schedule is empty as of April. I mean, their entire summer schedule just... So, it was I had actually decided to run before that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, when you've just decided, well, maybe it's time for a career change, and 3 weeks later, the job you've been doing 7 to 8 months out of a year disappears, it kind of goes, well, that's interesting timing. So I've been really spending the last 2 months educating myself as much as possible a lot of things I know about from the 30 years that I was involved in local politics. So it's like picking up where you left off on a long-running soap opera or something. And then there's other things that are brand new that I've been researching from scratch. I've been trying to teach myself how to read a budget. There should probably be a course at CMC for how to read a government budget. But I've been staying quite busy. And also I'm in a position where the lady I live with is got pre-existing conditions that make her a very high risk for COVID. So I'm under a sort of quasi lockdown to this day. She leaves the house to go shop for groceries, and that's pretty much it. And that obviously put a huge crimp in our travel. So I've had a lot of time to get caught up on things, and that's basically what I've been doing.
I'm curious, before you got locked down, where you got to travel for 20 years.
Oh, wow. The most recent really big complex trip we did was Tibet and northern India over about a 5-week period. That was fall of 2018. And that was the other thing that led to my deciding that now would be a good time to run. We have recently decided that when we travel, we want to keep it down to 2 weeks and not have it be a 4-country extravaganza. That was a fabulous trip. It took me 1.5 years just in the planning of it. And someday, who knows, I might process the photos. But we've had we love to snorkel, so we go to the Caribbean a lot, once every 2 years at least. Big fans of the Jazz Festival in New Orleans. We had tickets this year. That was sad. So, everybody's been in flux. And I don't have great confidence that's going to end anytime soon.
It does seem like at least there's going to be a slow growth out of it. If not, it won't be that January 1st we're all okay.
Well, and I can remember a time when we're all
up.
saying, well, we just have to do this another 4 to 6 weeks. And then it was another 4 to 6 weeks after that, and then after that. And of course now it's all going to roll into the flu season. And based on the standards we've set for ourselves with COVID, how are we ever going to go back to accepting the fact that 40 to 60,000 people every year die of the flu? How is that going to be now just a normal order of things? So I think we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner where either we're going to have to come up with some really amazing technological breakthroughs, or we're going to all be wearing masks for a long time. And I don't think anybody really wants to do that. So where that's going is going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
And the outlook changes weekly, so
right.
Who knows,
It is very unpredictable. How did you first end up in the Valley?
I came up for the weekend to visit a friend,
And when was that?
1970. So my stock joke, it's been a long weekend.
You can still make me laugh at that.
Most of my material's used up. It's nice to have a new audience.
Yeah.
The other one is I've been too broke to leave ever since.
Well, I understand that. So you've been in the Valley since 1970?
I hit a half century about a month ago.
Do you consider yourself an old timer?
I'm feeling a little crusty around the edges, but I don't know what the definitional standards are.
Well, I think there's been a dearth of curmudgeons in the Valley.
That has been one of my life goals since
Yeah.
I was 18. I wanted to be a great curmudgeon when I grew up. So I'm actually mellow. I was a better curmudgeon, I think, 20 years ago. I don't know. Maybe all that travel has mellowed me, but I might get it back. You never know.
Well, travel does change people.
Very definitely. I have a completely different perspective than I would if I hadn't done all of that.
How so?
Well, I did some traveling first year out of college because my parents couldn't figure out any other way to get me in college, so they signed me up for World Campus Afloat, which at various times have been known as Campus of the Seven Seas. I cannot tell you how different the world looks than it did then. The average person is so much more prosperous now than they were 50 years ago. And yet it's hard to tell people that. It's hard to spread an optimistic message. But, the miles upon miles of slums that used to, exist around every major capital city you can still find them outside of Lima, you can still find them in Nairobi, are a fraction of the size of what they once were. And, you look at the actual figures for how much people's incomes have risen and the whole thing, it's really remarkable, the trajectory the world has been on in terms of everyone being able to eat. Yeah, I know there's a lot of refugees right now. I think we're at some kind of world record. But it's still all the old rivalries. And of course, we don't travel to those areas, so I don't get that perspective. I'm talking about the portion of the world that's managed to step out of those rivalries and maintain some of a normal life. And it's been improving just about everywhere.
Do you think life in the valley has been improving as well? Or?
Oh, it's just going sideways. It's not going to be the place I came to in 1970. I want all the same funky restaurants and, the same hippie chicks. I want the whole thing just like it was in 1970. And if government can't give that to me, I'm going to get upset. And unfortunately, depending on who you talk to, that year is 1980 or it's 1990 or it's 2000. And basically, whenever you walk into the valley, whatever the date is, whether it was 3 weeks ago, if it suits you, then you go, wow, this is it.
Right.
And from that point on, anybody who changes anything is some sort of enemy. And that's been a large part of our problem over the years. It would be a good idea to accept some of the changes. And most of them are not that negative.
How I'm trying to figure out how to phrase, how would you see the changes that have changed as positive? That's a terrible sentence, but...
What's the most positive change? Well, again, speaking of the Upper Valley, and because I'm trying to sort of focus this on Pitkin County since that's the office I'm running for. My gosh, if we got it good. The sidewalks aren't broken, the street lights work. We have a huge, what seems huge to me, hospital. You just go down the line, and in terms of the standard of living that extends to everybody. You don't have to be a billionaire to take advantage of most of it. The standard of living is almost world record. For human race history, it's almost a world record. I mean, damn, we've got it good. And of course, human beings, being what they are, counting your blessings is not high on most people's list for some reason. And there's always still a tendency to harp on those things that are not working. And that's why we keep improving things, basically. I guess that instinct has a purpose. But every now and then, like today, it's just gorgeous outside. What's the date today? We can tell people to look it up. It's the 8th. Gorgeous day outside. And those types of things, and I realize that's not a change from 1970. But it's certainly a change in the fact that you need to remind people of that, because you sure didn't in 1970. Everybody noticed when it was a beautiful day, and they were out, grinning at each other. So some of the things that we have gained in terms of, creature comforts and access to medical care and response to emergencies and not having to wait in lift lines. I mean, you can go down the list, check mark, check mark, check mark, check mark, of all the things that have been upgraded and improved. I don't know if the happiness quotient has gone up. And it depends who you talk to on a given day. But overall, I think there needs to be a lot more stopping and smelling the roses sort of thing going on. And maybe we're just too wound up to be able to do that. And of course, that's not a governmental issue. People just have to deal with it on their own.
Right. That's true. But what are the governmental issues in your mind? What inspired you to run for county commissioner?
I literally call my campaign Back to Basics, and I'm not a slogan-y kind of guy typically. But there is a tendency to just overcomplicate everything. And there are simple, basic things that should have been done long ago that haven't. I just went through that whole checklist. And yet we still have a completely artificial traffic jam at the entrance to Aspen. It doesn't need to be there. It's part of a social engineering project. There are any number of things that could be made easier. I just wrote a thing for the Roaring Fork Conservancy about water on the Crystal River. And I was looking at the new grant request, and they're talking about things like alluvial augmentation and recharge pits. And I finally said at the end of they asked me to comment on a couple of questions. I said, my approach is, I don't know how many of my constituents are going to be speaking in the language of alluvial augmentation and recharge pits. I think that everybody is of the mind that they don't want to see a dam on the Crystal. They don't want to see the Crystal dry up. And when they turn their faucet, they want water to come out. So that's the core issue, I think. And that's what I'll be looking at in anything that comes across the table in terms of that issue. And it's the same thing with transportation. My God, the plan they have for the airport would be a couple $100 million to make a really poor arrival experience. You can pull into one of the least developed countries in the world, fly into their airport, get off, get your luggage, and if you've made prior arrangements, there's going to be a guy there with a sign with either your name on it or your property name on it. He's going to help with your luggage from that point, and in some cases all the way until you check into your room. Aspen, Colorado can't even come close to matching that. We're supposedly world-class, high-end, best of everything. Right now, because of the new restrictions they put on drivers being able to come into the terminal, everybody gets their luggage, they come out, and they're faced with a lineup of cars with their tail ends pointed at them. And they're expected to wander down the line until they can find a vehicle with the right name on it. So it's the simple stuff that we're really not handling well at all. And I said on an interview very recently, I can't remember what ELN stands for. Anyway, and I was talking about that very thing. I want to do ride-alongs with the Sheriff's Department. I want to go out with a crew that patches holes in the pavement. I want to see how they patch potholes. I want to get back down to that kind of level because I think all of us feel a little fraying around the edges. Everybody wants to talk about the big picture, 20 years out, grand plans. How are we going to handle growth projections 30 years from now? Well, we never met the growth projections from 30 years ago, so why are we obsessing over them? But in the meantime, there's some really simple stuff that needs to be addressed. Little things like when your 2-lane highway is no longer adequate, what you do is you add an additional lane. It's called, lane capacity. And if you have insufficient lane capacity, there's only one way to fix that, and that's with sufficient lane capacity. This is a completely different subject than mass transit. They almost don't even have anything in common with each other. And we were past the lane capacity, or getting close to being beyond the lane capacity, back in 1969, when the state first came to the city of Aspen and said, you need to start planning on widening the entrance, to handle the traffic volumes you're going to have in a very few years. So this year was also the 50th anniversary of the first occasion when the City of Aspen City Council said, we want you to hold off for a while 4-laning the entrance while we study mass transit options. Okay, we've studied it now for 50 years. And the same problem is what it was before, which is that 3-dimensional reality is very unforgiving, and you cannot put 2 items in the same space at the same time. It's a basic law of physics. You cannot fix the entrance to Aspen without expanding lane capacity, period. And all the money that you spend on more studies and more consultants isn't going to change that because you can't change 3-dimensional reality. So let's get back to basics, do what we should have done 30 years ago, get the highway fixed, live with it for a couple of years, and then if you think you need more mass transit, do something about it.
We're back to the EIS that you talked about in the early or the late 80s.
The official start of that was 1989.
Yeah. Where the EIS was approved that doesn't include 4-laning into Aspen.
Well, the draft certainly did, and the voters of Aspen certainly approved it, but then we had elected officials who refused to accept the decision of the voting public, which really undermined civic participation in the Upper Valley for decades. In fact, for some people who are still around to this day. I still get, well, yeah, we'll vote on it, but so what? They're just going to ignore us. They're going to do what they want to do. I always stop and say, who's they? They never seem to have an answer for that. But somehow or another, there's been a mindset, and I hate to keep coming back to Aspen because they're not the whole of Pitkin County, obviously. And that's another one of the reasons I decided to run. I'm in District 5. I know there's a lot of people in the county who are heavily negatively affected by that situation. Nobody ever asked them what they think. And yet it's a state highway. Everybody in the state, quite frankly, based on the EIS that was started in 1989, the purpose of which was to increase capacity to improve travel times, it would not be out of line for the federal government to come and ask for their money back. You know, if you're not going to finish this highway, you're never going to have established, you'll never have resolved the project need that we identified, which is why we gave you the money. Now, that's not going to happen, but I'll tell you, it'd be perfectly appropriate. There'd be no good reason not to, because they spent all that money and we still have the same travel time by car during peak periods that we had in 1989. In fact, it's worse. So that's not typically how you want to spend public money, is to spend hundreds of millions of dollars and make a situation worse. Just not a good general outlook or strategy.
Is this a kind of, you're passionate about this?
Well, because it represents so many other things.
Yeah.
It's just, in terms of public policy, you can't get anything simpler than the highway. I mean, I don't care where you go in the world, in terms of level of development or culture or religion or anything else. Everybody knows that when your 2-lane highway is maxed out, the thing to do is add an additional lane. You get a 100% increase in capacity. There is nothing else like it in all of transportation. It's our inability for either our quote leaders or our quote consultants or the public at large to just say, clear the decks and let's get back to what we needed to do. That is what scares me more than the actual condition of the highway. The other thing that happened along the way was we once did a petition. I was involved in a lot of petition drives in the first 30 years. And we did finally one that was going to be maybe the definitive way of solving the problem. And it spent 6 years in the courts before it finally got to the Colorado Supreme Court. Most people don't realize that, but that decision, called Wagner versus City of Aspen, did enormous damage to initiative and referendum on the local level, because they essentially applied a standard that would only be appropriate for a statewide issue. And they dramatically reduced the subject matter which can be done under an initiative in a small town. So that still is eating at me. I don't know what to do about that, but I'd certainly like to be on the Board of County Commissioners and say, guys, part of the reason I wasn't able to run this petition to get the voters an opportunity to weigh in, county voters, I was going to ask them for money to actually build the thing, is because you have a provision in the county charter that says we can't do an initiative on any kind of a tax issue. I said, that's in direct violation of the state constitution. I don't think we should have a county charter that's in direct violation of the state constitution.
And
How
this
about if
is
we
the
change that?
Wagner versus
City of Aspen.
City of
That was the case that sort of brought out the problem. The state said, well, this proposal, to change this to a 4-lane highway, that's just a lane management decision. That's a classic administrative issue. Well, they didn't seem to grasp that this was a policy issue where you're literally asking people to change the way they transport themselves.
So this petition to 4-lane the highway?
What it was going to be was actually an approval by the people of Pitkin County to use some local funds to build it. And the reason being, we've done this several times. We've advanced the money to the state, and then they pay us back when they get the funds for the project. They did that with the roundabout at one point. So that thought process was kind of more familiar at the time, where we put up some local money, we get the project moving, state reimburses us years from now when their budgets catch up, and we were just flat out told that you can't circulate that petition. That's not a question you can ask Pitkin County residents. And nobody knows that happened, but it all goes into this larger picture that keeps me motivated. well beyond anything to do with the stupid traffic backup, which is totally artificial and a complete waste of everybody's time and energy, and I mean energy in the broader sense, and really shouldn't be there. I mean, communities don't normally put up with that sort of thing. At some point, somebody says, we need to demand action. And it's the lack of that response that almost scares me more than anything else. The fact that everybody just say, oh, it's City Hall, you can't do anything about it. Well, I'm not really along with that. I don't think that's the right attitude to take. So the symbolism of the entrance to Aspen, I think, is so much broader in the sense of what it means in terms of government power over the individual. And that question really keeps me motivated.
So would you say that's the central reason why you're running?
Not necessarily at this moment. It does go back to those 20 years that I stepped out of it, because I'm thinking, it used to be I could list off everybody on the county commission and city council and tell you about where they stood on this particular issue. Look at the city council. I know those guys. I've known Tory for years. I know Skippy, et cetera. I have no idea where they are on this. Not a clue. So part of it was just to say, let's just raise the question, put myself out there as someone who sees things from a different perspective, and see if there's anybody else out there who thinks maybe a different perspective would be useful at this particular moment in history. Local history, I was thinking. Mm-hmm. And then the COVID hit. I'm going, well, then I started thinking, well, with 50 years under my belt, I'm a lot like, well, it turns out, I'm not going to be able to think of her name now. Good grief. Patty Clapper, turns out, hasn't been here as long as I thought. I thought she might be a lifer, but that's because of the Clapper last name, of course. And I thought, well, there would be at least 4 of us on that board who remember the county when it was mostly concerned with plowing the roads and keeping the sheriff fed. And that was, I've got an old county budget somewhere. It's this thick. Right. And I said, if we have to get back to that, I'm one of the people who can visualize that and not have it scare me too much. Because I know we can still get along under those circumstances. So that was the other thing that shortly after I declared this whole thing happening, I'm thinking, you know what, I might actually be a fairly appropriate person to be in that role at that time. The other thing that attracted me to it is the fact it was an open seat. I don't want to run against an incumbent and spend the whole time having to attack the incumbent. Oh, they're not doing it right. Well, that's not the way to take on a new task.
Yeah, that can be fairly unpleasant.
Very unpleasant, and most of the time, I did not follow George Newman's career very closely. I'd be willing to bet he tried very hard. I'm sure he did the best he could. And if I were to go through it vote by vote, I might find all sorts of things I disagree with him on. But at this point, so what? It's an open seat. I have a different perspective on things. That might come in handy. And if nothing else, all those people who've had to put up with that mess at the entrance for all those years will finally have an advocate. And they might like that.
I'm curious about one thing you said, and this may be opening up a can.
Only one? Jeez, I'm slipping.
No. I'm curious about a lot of them, but one in particular was that it's common orthodoxy that mass transit and 4-laning the highway are linked.
They don't have anything to do with each other.
Tell me about that.
Oh, for a while we were raising potfuls of money and doing things like doing presentations at the Wheeler Opera House. And during that era, I became sort of not a friend, but an associate of this guy who's a legitimate, full-bore international transportation consultant. So 1 week or two, I decided to sit down, and I had come across a bunch of info on the dot.gov site. And when I look at the RAFTA service area, I always think in terms of 10 zip codes that extend all the way up to Meredith in one direction and all the way out to Rifle in the other direction, all the way up to Aspen. That to me is the RAFTA service area. And I use that as my population figure. And I started looking at that, and I'm going to lose my train of thought here because there's several different directions I could go with that. But I looked at it and I said, okay, taking the population and the ridership of RAFTA, what percentage of the person trips, and a person trip is when you get off your chair, go down to the local store and come back again, that's 2 person trips. That's whether you ride your bike, drive your car, or walk. It's a person trip. So I said, DOT.gov has an estimation of the average number of person trips per person in the United States. I know what the ridership is on RAFTA. I did all the numbers and said, looks like they're accounting for about 4% of the person trips. So I ran that by my transportation consultant. Oh no, he says, that's way too high. So you never get above 1.5%, maybe 2% in the United States. He says, you can't get over 10% in Europe, where the whole society is built around their transit system. Well, there's your range, Reid. Somewhere between 1.5% and 10% of the person trips can potentially be diverted to mass transit. That number doesn't have anything to do with the amount of highway capacity you need. You know, whether it's 1.5% or 4% is certainly not going to affect whether you need 2 lanes or 4. So there's never enough impact from mass transit. You can say, oh, well, we got enough roads now, we can forget about that. You know, the orders of magnitude between the two makes them really quite separate from one another. You have mass transit in order to provide transportation, and I've said this a number of times and nobody ever seems to understand it. The public interest in mass transit is you provide mobility for people who are too young, too old, or too broke to own and operate a vehicle. Because everybody who doesn't fit those categories most likely has a vehicle. Now, once you have it up and running, I mean, if I live 2 blocks from a RAFTA bus stop somewhere in Carbondale and I'm working a job up in Aspen 8 hours a day, and then I come right home, you bet I'm using the bus. I mean, why would I do anything else? But then you have the fact that all of this has done no good in terms of traffic volumes, or it's not enough good to make any difference about what sort of highway capacity or infrastructure you need. So then we get into all this coercive stuff. Oh, we're going to make people ride the bus by having this traffic jam at the entrance to town, you know, or we're going to make people pay to drive into town during certain times of day. The latest one is they want to put taxes on private parking areas in Aspen, taxes on private property, so that those lot owners will have to charge something to people who park. This is their latest auto disincentive. Well, this is why I talk about the symbolism of this whole thing, because my orientation is government should facilitate the choices we make, not dictate what our choices are. And that's a huge divide. And again, it's like the difference between the individual and the collective. I tend to want to support the individual and support their interests. And I think that viewpoint has been missing. And this coercive business about how you're supposed to transport yourself, nobody gets up in the morning and says, how does my government want me to get from point A to point B? They think of all the places they've got to go, all the stuff they have to take with them, all the stuff they have to pick up, the number of people, blah, 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 blah. None of us can live our lives without the automobile. It's not going anywhere. And when you don't adequately provide for it, it makes a mess.
On the other hand,
Yes.
you know, people do make the argument that if we're all driving individual cars and there's not mass transit, it's not only a convenience issue, but there are air quality issues. There's carbon consumption issues. What do you think about those?
Well, just years ago, I tried to look up how many people need to be on a bus before it's actually a better choice than a private vehicle. And the range was ridiculous. I found one person who said you need 4 people per bus in order to where it's equal between that same number of people traveling in private cars, based on the average occupancy of a car, which is more than 1, by the way. But the lowest one I found was 4, and they didn't look at anything much more than fuel consumption. The highest one I found is you got to have 20 people per bus. Well, that's a lot of people per bus in order to, now that guy had gone to the trouble of talking about all of the resources that are consumed by the people administering and driving. In other words, he was talking about the whole collection of people who are driving the bus, their transportation needs, you know, their fuel, their resource consumption. I thought, well, that's a little over the top, because in theory, those people exist anyway. It's not like they suddenly started consuming, resources because they got a job with the bus. But these days, when RAFTA is recruiting, literally from overseas, to bring in drivers during the winter. They're in the employee housing business now, where they build housing for their drivers. All of a sudden, that guy's assumptions don't seem that extreme anymore, where you're literally bringing people into the valley to keep this system running. Well, last week, I went back and started to look at what those estimates are these days, what happened since I looked them up the last time. Couldn't find them in those terms anymore. And I would have, if I'd known we were going to go that way, I would have brought this little thing I could hold up. But the estimate now is that a commuter bus at 25% occupancy is not as efficient in terms of use of resources as that same number of people in private cars. So how many of the bus runs, what's the average occupancy on all the different routes? Have you known anybody on Rafta board to ask that question? Or any of the local communities or their elected officials going, Dan, by the way, what is your occupancy rate on your various routes? Are we getting up over 25% on average? And if you're not looking at it that way, there's no way to answer the question you just asked. We actually, honest to God, don't know if we're doing any good in terms of energy consumption.
Yeah, we're assuming they don't look at it.
Well, the last time I asked for it, I didn't see it. I haven't been able, and I've asked for it several times over the years. I've eventually got one for just the valley route. And it was actually more a case of, we went back and forth for a while about how many miles each rider is on the valley route. And the average I came up with was around 16, and we use 18. Well, okay. You can get to that number with that kinds of information. But I don't know that they've ever done anything like that for the overall system. And without that, and this is what I think most jurisdictions would be one of the things they look at first. And I know they have a sense of it because they scale, runs back during the off seasons. And so, whether it's just all seat of the pants or whether they've got a whole chart somewhere that I somehow have never gotten my hands on. But what astonishes me is you don't have any elected officials asking for it. That's what's missing. Because you can easily get to the point. I mean, a bus is a really big vehicle. It takes a lot of resources just to build one. And then you got to run it around at 3 miles an hour, or 3 miles per gallon, on and on and on. And then you got the driver and his, needs, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a sense that transit is a good thing. I'm a good person. Therefore, I support transit. And I want to be the one who raises their hand and says, I think there's a little more to it than that. Let's start looking at the operational characteristics and determine whether we're really accomplishing anything here. You don't build a giant bus system for the sake of building a giant bus system. There has to be some aim you're trying to satisfy. And of course, depending on how you want to characterize it, you can get real mean. I mean, I can tell you the whole bus system is meant to serve the real estate scheme that's going on in the Upper Valley. Because I'm one of those people, I don't even agree with the downzoning of Aspen in 1974. You want to go back to that? We'll talk about energy resources being used up. Because that's what eventually sent everybody down valley and made it so they have to be transported back and forth. So where do you want to take that, and what aspect of it do you want to study? And oh my God, we've got an industry. You and I can become rich, Reid, studying that very kind of thing. We'll become consultants and tell everybody you got to have these numbers.
So where do you want to take it? Would you change the zoning too? Are you back to basics? Are you?
If you need more affordable housing, you need to zone more property for multifamily. There's a back to basic. And I'm not sure that anybody, one of the standard oxymorons you're required to utter if you want to run for office in Pitkin County or Aspen is you've got to say we need stricter growth controls and more affordable housing. And you go, wait a minute, how do those two things work? So I'm not talking about changing the trajectory. I'm not talking about trying to go back and reel in the tape and replay it with some different choices made along the line. I know what we have today, and I'm still comfortable here, and I'm more than happy working within that context. But still, at some point, you gotta go, wait a minute, what is the purpose of this? And how can, I mean, I was saying the other day, this valley could not function if not for all the people who went out, cleared a little bit of land, 5 minutes, cleared a little bit of land, set up a trailer court. It's the most down and dirty form of housing development there is. And yet today, we couldn't survive if that hadn't have happened. Think of all the different trailer courts we've got stashed around, all the way up in downtown Aspen, for God's sake, they've got a trailer court. So I want to raise questions like, well, why aren't we talking about having a new trailer court somewhere? And the existing ones have been expanded. It's not like, they've just shut the door on it. But find me that zoning anywhere in the Pitkin County Land Use Code, or anywhere for someone to apply to have their property zoned that way. And yet, right now, the last thing I looked at, the Upper Valley is spending anywhere from $1/4 to $500,000 per full-time employee to provide employee housing. That's a lot of money. And I don't think the average employer will say, oh, I'll put up $250,000, no problem. So it's got to be public money. Nobody wants anything where they are. It's the old location, location, location. We can do a lot with affordable housing if you can find me a place where you could put a few hundred units without anybody freaking out. But that's not possible. The smaller the project, the more expensive it's going to be per unit. But I'm absolutely dead serious. We need to start asking questions like, well, can we expand the existing trailer courts? If not, are there any landowners out there who'd like to have one? Because certainly the development costs are not that great. And if necessary, people can bring their own units. I mean, we wouldn't survive up there in terms of construction if not for the KOA down here on the Crystal River. Those are the types of questions, even if the conversation doesn't lead anywhere, we need to start asking those kinds of questions. What's the simplest way we could handle this? Not necessarily the dressiest or the one that'll provide housing for the next 70 years. What's the simplest way we can approach this? And I would say, well, why don't you go figure out what land could realistically be zoned multifamily? And if you want to put rental or sales limits on it, go ahead and do it. Because I guarantee I worked in the development business long enough to know that if there's any opportunity out there, someone's going to want to take it.
Is that the business you've been in?
I was an architectural model builder for 29 years.
Okay.
And I worked with, at one point, almost all the architects in the valley, not in the valley, but in the Upper Valley. So I got to see a lot of it from the other end. And I'm here to tell you, developers are as different as snowflakes. There's someone who just love to do a 50-unit affordable housing. That would be just right down their alley. There are others, all they want to do is $10 million private homes. It's not like developers only want to go where the most money is. They all have different interests, just like the rest of us. And some of them are very, very good at what they do. The other thing that's astonished me over the years is the people who are most adamant about having more affordable housing are quite often the same people who treat the entire construction industry or residential construction industry like some sort of an enemy. I mean, those are the people you need to come in and tell you how to do it, Let's call a truce and talk about this. And I can do that because I still know a lot of those people. They know they can come talk to me. I'm not going to treat them like the enemy.
Yeah.
So that could turn out to be helpful.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it.
I like ending unhelpful.
Yeah. I appreciate it, Jeffrey, and
My pleasure.
thank you for the time and for submitting yourself.
I have to tell you, I was a little worried. What's the name of this thing?
Probeline.
I thought there was going to be some kind of medical requirement for running for office.
We quit that a long time ago.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. All right. Yeah.
And that concludes another episode of Probeline. I hope it's been helpful getting to know Jeffrey Evans, who would like to be the county commissioner in District 5. Thank you for watching. Please support us if you can.